It was the kind of day that seemed too perfect for anything unpleasant to occur. Early June had laid a gentle warmth over the village of Chipping Dean, a place known more for its climbing roses than for any excitement. The skies were a delicate robin's egg blue, the hedgerows freshly clipped, and the vicar's wife had outdone herself with the table linens. The garden party at the Gables, hosted by the recently widowed Mrs. Isabel Fanshawe, had drawn most of the village's better half. There were finger sandwiches with watercress, strawberry tarts dusted with icing sugar, and lemonade that sparkled faintly in the glass. Miss Marple, in a pale lavender frock and sensible shoes, sat beneath a lilac tree, quietly observing the scene with the mild, content expression of someone who had long since learned how to listen more than speak. She took a particular interest in Mrs. Fanshawe, not because of any rudeness or impropriety, but because the woman was new enough to the village to still wear her grief like a freshly tailored coat, stiff and purposeful. Her husband, Major Fanshawe, had died in a hunting accident the previous autumn, and the matter had been laid to rest with unseemly speed. Still, Isabel carried on graciously, arranging luncheons and tending to her prize-winning irises. It was just past 4 when the first oddity occurred. Young Alec Roper, the postman's son, came bounding through the gate, waving something in his hand. "Beg pardon, Mrs. Fanshawe," he called breathlessly, cheeks flushed. "Mum says I'm to give you this straight away. It came without a stamp." He held out a single postcard. The moment Mrs. Fanshawe took it, Miss Marple noticed the tremble in her hand. Her smile tightened as her eyes scanned the brief lines scrawled in an untidy, hurried script. "How very strange," Mrs. Fanshawe murmured, pressing the card to her chest as though shielding it from view. "How very inappropriate." Before anyone could question her further, a scream echoed from the rear of the house, a high, panicked cry, not the kind one expected from a spoiled child or a garden mishap, but the kind that tightened the air and made everyone freeze in place. It was Peggy Lonsdale, the maid. They found her just inside the back hallway, near the pantry. She stood against the wall, eyes wide, mouth trembling, pointing one shaking finger toward the floor. There, quite clearly, was a man's shoe protruding from beneath the pantry door. Inside, slumped awkwardly between shelves of preserved plums and boxes of tea, was the body of Mr. Harold Hensley, the village solicitor. Dead. As the screams gave way to gasps and someone summoned Dr. Meredith, Miss Marple remained seated beneath the lilac tree. Her tea had cooled, and the sandwich in her hand now felt oddly heavy. She did not rush forward like the others, nor did she cry out. Instead, her eyes moved quietly from face to face, from Isabel Fanshawe, whose complexion had turned the color of porcelain, to young Alec, still holding his cap in both hands, to Reverend Kelso, who muttered a prayer he clearly did not yet believe was needed. It was not just the death that had disturbed the peace of Chipping Dean. It was the timing and the postcard, sent without a stamp. The news of Mr. Harold Hensley's death spread through Chipping Dean like a sudden chill on an otherwise bright day. In the rooms of the Gables, the guests who had been enjoying their lemonade and tarts now gathered in hushed clusters, eyes darting anxiously from one face to another. Voices that had been soft and polite moments before were now trembling with shock, confusion, and an eagerness to make sense of the impossible. Miss Marple watched them all, seated still beneath the lilac tree, her hands folded calmly in her lap. She observed the rustle of skirts, the quick exchange of glances, and the way some villagers instinctively edged closer to those they trusted, as if proximity could shield them from the unsettling presence of death. Her eyes settled briefly on Mrs. Isabel Fanshawe, whose usual composure had been replaced by a delicate pallor, and whose fingers clutched the postcard as though it were both a talisman and a burden. "The poor man," whispered Mrs. Agnes Copley, the village school teacher, her voice tight with distress. "Harold Hensley, struck down in a place of domestic peace. Who would have thought?" "Who indeed?" murmured the Reverend Kelso, though his usual calm did not quite reach his eyes. A reminder, perhaps, that none of us are beyond fate's reach. Alec Roper, still flushed and wide-eyed, found himself the center of a sudden, unwelcome attention. I only delivered the card, sir. I swear I didn't see anything unusual," he stammered when questioned by the local constable, Sergeant Price, who had just arrived on the scene, summoned in haste. Miss Marple noticed that Alec's gaze flickered nervously toward the back door, the direction from which he had come. His fingers twisted the rim of his cap, betraying more anxiety than mere boyish nerves might explain. Yet no one seemed to pay much heed to the boy's discomfort. The village's focus had swiftly turned to the body in the pantry and the troubling circumstances around it. Dr. Meredith arrived shortly after, his presence a quiet reassurance amid the growing turmoil. He was a middle-aged man with spectacles that perpetually slid down his nose and a calm demeanor well suited to moments of crisis. After a brief examination, he confirmed what everyone feared. Mr. Hensley was dead. The cause was less clear. There was no obvious wound, no blood. The old doctor's gaze was grave as he knelt by the body, lifting the man's eyelids gently and listening for a pulse that was not there. "Likely a heart attack," he said, almost reluctantly. "Or a stroke. Sudden and no one to aid him." The murmurs of relief were faint and brief. It was hard to believe that something so tragic could be so natural. The postcard, the absence of a stamp, the timing of the death, these things unsettled even the most composed. Sergeant Price, a pragmatic man with a keen eye for detail, began taking statements. The guests were soon gathered in the drawing room, where the air was thick with unease and curiosity. Miss Marple, despite the swirl of activity, made her way indoors quietly, her presence noted but not yet understood by those around her. "Tell me, Mrs. Fanshawe," the sergeant began, his tone courteous but firm. "Did Mr. Hensley receive any visitors recently? Anyone who might have wished him ill?" Mrs. Fanshawe's voice was steady but tinged with sorrow. Harold was well liked, though he had his disagreements, as any solicitor might. Lately, he seemed preoccupied. I found him restless, but he wouldn't say why. "Any unusual correspondence?" Price pressed. Mrs. Fanshawe hesitated, glancing at the postcard still clenched in her hand. "This came today," she said softly. "I don't know who sent it. There's no name, just a message." Miss Marple's eyes briefly met the sergeant's as Mrs. Fanshawe unfolded the postcard and read aloud. "The past is never truly buried. Some debts must be paid." A ripple of unease passed through the room. The cryptic note was unsettling, its tone ominous. Yet it was the missing stamp that most intrigued Miss Marple. Postcards without stamps rarely traveled far. This one must have been delivered in some other manner, or slipped through the system deliberately. Whispers erupted among the villagers. Could this be a threat, a warning, or merely a cruel prank? The vicar's wife, Mrs. Eliza Kelso, clutched her prayer book tightly, her eyes moist. "Such wickedness in our peaceful village," she murmured. "Who would do such a thing?" "It's never that simple," Miss Marple thought quietly, noting the way some of the assembled faces masked relief, while others showed barely concealed anxiety. Human nature, she reflected, was a wellspring of both kindness and cruelty, often concealed beneath polite smiles and measured words. As the afternoon waned, the villagers slowly dispersed, returning to their homes but leaving the questions swirling like the summer breeze through the garden. Only a few lingered, drawn by the desire to understand what had shattered their everyday tranquility. Miss Marple, sensing the unrest, decided to visit the solicitor's home later that evening. She wished to observe the place where Mr. Hensley had spent his final hours, to note the arrangement of his belongings and the atmosphere that surrounded him. The solicitor's house was a modest, well-kept cottage on the edge of the village. The garden was neat but unremarkable. the faint scent of lavender mingling with freshly turned earth. Inside, the air was still, touched with the faint odor of pipe tobacco and leather-bound ledgers. Miss Marple wandered through the rooms with quiet attentiveness. She paused by the desk where Mr. Hensley had sat, noting a few papers scattered carelessly. A letter half opened, a ledger with figures hastily crossed out. The envelope bore no return address, much like the postcard. Her sharp eyes caught sight of a small folded piece of paper tucked beneath a heavy book. She retrieved it delicately and unfolded it. The note was brief and cryptic. "Meet me where the past begins. Midnight. Alone." Her mind quietly catalogued the oddities, the unsigned postcard, the threatening notes, the sudden death. It was as if Mr. Hensley had been caught in a web of secrets that someone desperately wished to keep hidden. Returning home, Miss Marple found the village already simmering with speculation. At the corner shop, Mrs. Copley was recounting her theory that the solicitor had been involved in some scandal. At the pub, Mr. Larkins, the local grocer, was loudly declaring that the death was no accident. Yet Miss Marple remained silent, observing the ripples each rumor caused, noting who seemed eager to spread suspicion and who sought to quell it. What troubled her most was the deliberate nature of the postcard's delivery. It spoke of a message meant to unsettle, to remind Mr. Hensley that someone held power over him, and the warning to meet where the past begins suggested a rendezvous that never happened, or one that had ended in tragedy. As night settled over Chipping Dean, the village seemed to hold its breath, awaiting answers that were nowhere yet in sight. Miss Marple sat by her window, a cup of tea cooling untouched at her side, her thoughts weaving through the lives she had known for so long. There was much beneath the surface of this tranquil place. Old resentments, hidden debts, secrets carefully buried like roots beneath the garden soil. And Miss Marple was certain that the key to uncovering the truth lay in those silent depths, waiting patiently to be uncovered. The game had only just begun. The morning air was crisp and clear as Miss Marple made her way through the village toward the little shop where she often exchanged pleasantries with Mrs. Copley. Though the village was still steeped in the shadow of Harold Hensley's death, the daily rhythms insisted on continuing, no matter how feebly. The villagers were gathering in small groups outside the church and the post office, their conversations hushed but unmistakably pointed. Every face seemed marked by the recent tragedy, and every pair of eyes held a question they dared not speak aloud. Miss Marple paused by the post office, where Alec Roper was nervously arranging letters behind the counter. The boy looked up as she approached, his fingers still trembling slightly. "Good morning, Alec," she said gently. "How are you this morning?" He swallowed hard, attempting a smile that faltered at the edges. "I'm all right, thank you, Miss Marple. Just a bit worried, I suppose." "Understandable," she replied, nodding. "Sometimes it's the small things that matter most. Tell me, have you noticed anything unusual about the postcards or letters you've delivered recently? Anything out of the ordinary?" Alec hesitated, then lowered his voice. "Well, there was that one card with no stamp, the one I brought to Mrs. Fanshawe yesterday. It felt odd, but I thought maybe someone had just forgotten. I didn't want to cause trouble." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Sometimes forgetting a stamp is no accident at all." Alec's gaze dropped. "I suppose you're right." Before she could ask more, Mrs. Copley appeared, her brow furrowed as she clutched a basket of flowers. "Miss Marple, have you heard the latest?" "What news, Agnes?" Miss Marple inquired, curious despite herself. "Another note has been found," Mrs. Copley whispered, lowering her voice. "This one slipped under the vicarage door just before dawn. It's addressed to Reverend Kelso." Intrigued, Miss Marple accompanied her to the vicarage, where Reverend Kelso stood quietly on the doorstep, reading the note with a grave expression. "Good morning, Reverend," Miss Marple said softly. "May I see the note?" The vicar extended the paper and she read, "Secrets fester where silence reigns. Speak now or be forever bound." Miss Marple's lips pressed into a thin line. The message was clear and pointed, designed to unsettle and to provoke. The question remained, who was behind these cryptic warnings, and what secrets were so dangerous they warranted such intimidation? Reverend Kelso sighed, folding the note carefully. "I fear someone wishes to dredge up the past, things best left alone, but I am not sure what they hope to gain." Miss Marple's gaze lingered thoughtfully on the vicar's lined face. "Sometimes, Reverend, the past is more alive than we suspect. It reaches out in ways we cannot always see." As the morning advanced, news spread of the note at the vicarage, fueling the whispers and suspicions. The villagers, already on edge from Mr. Hensley's death, now found themselves entangled in a web of menace and unanswered questions. Miss Marple decided it was time to revisit the Gables, to speak once more with Mrs. Fanshawe. She hoped the widow's new role as hostess of the ill-fated garden party might yield further clues. Isabel Fanshawe was seated by the window, her fingers resting lightly on the postcard she had shown the day before. She looked tired, but there was a quiet resolve in her eyes. "Mrs. Fanshawe," Miss Marple began, "I wonder if you might tell me more about Mr. Hensley's recent activities. You mentioned he seemed distracted. Did he say anything to you about a meeting or someone from his past?" Isabel nodded slowly. "Harold was uneasy in recent weeks. He spoke of old cases reopening, debts that were not only financial but personal. I sensed he feared someone, though he never named them." "Old cases," Miss Marple mused. "Those can be tricky. They often have a way of catching up with people." Isabel's gaze dropped to the postcard again. There was something else. Before the party, Harold received a visitor, a stranger, a man I'd never seen before, dressed in a manner that seemed out of place here. Miss Marple's interest sharpened. "Did he say who this man was?" "No," Isabel replied. "Harold spoke only briefly, but afterwards he seemed more troubled than ever." "Do you know if Harold ever mentioned where the past begins?" Miss Marple asked, referencing the note she had found at the solicitor's home. The widow shook her head. "No, but I wonder if it might mean the old mill by the river, the place where Harold and his family lived before moving here." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Places hold memories, sometimes painful ones. It might be worth a visit." Later that afternoon, Miss Marple took a solitary walk along the river bank, following the winding path toward the abandoned mill. The building stood like a forgotten relic, its weathered stones cloaked in ivy and shadow. It was a place of silence and secrets. Inside, dust motes danced in the slanting sunlight, and the air smelled of damp wood and history. Miss Marple's footsteps echoed softly as she explored the small rooms, her mind turning over the fragments of information she had gathered. In one corner, she found a faded photograph, yellowed with age. It showed a younger Harold Hensley, standing beside a stern-looking man in a uniform whose eyes seemed to hold a cold determination. Miss Marple tucked the photograph into her pocket. She sensed the story behind it was important, though its full meaning remained hidden. As she left the mill, the evening began to fall, casting long shadows across the village. Returning to the Gables, Miss Marple found the atmosphere charged with tension. That night, a small gathering convened in the village hall, called by Sergeant Price to address the growing unease. The villagers came, some eager for answers, others simply seeking reassurance. Voices rose and fell, accusations whispered and denied. The sergeant urged calm and patience, but beneath the surface, suspicion simmered. Miss Marple listened quietly, noting who spoke and who remained silent, who sought to deflect blame and who seemed genuinely distressed. She observed Mrs. Fanshawe standing near the back, pale but composed. She watched Alec Roper nervously shifting from foot to foot, and Reverend Kelso, whose calm exterior seemed to thin with each passing minute. The meeting ended without resolution, but Miss Marple's mind was active. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to take shape. Old grievances, hidden meetings, threatening messages. And at the heart of it all was the man who had died so suddenly in the pantry, clutching a secret that someone had been desperate enough to warn him about. Miss Marple knew that to unravel this mystery, she would have to look beyond what was spoken, beyond the surface politeness of the village, to the subtle shifts in behavior, the barely noticeable gestures that revealed the true nature of those involved. The postcard without a stamp, the notes of warning, the secret meeting place by the river, all pointed to a story that was only just beginning to unfold. As she retired that night, Miss Marple felt the familiar thrill of a mystery that called to her sharp mind and patient heart. The village of Chipping Dean might seem peaceful, but beneath its quiet exterior lurked a tale of secrets, lies, and, perhaps, betrayal. And she was determined to uncover it all, one careful step at a time. The morning sun rose over Chipping Dean with a soft golden light that belied the heavy mood hanging over the village. Though life moved forward, shops opened, church bells rang, and children scurried along the lanes, the shadow of Harold Hensley's sudden death lingered like a thick mist. Miss Marple sat in her cozy parlor, the kettle gently simmering on the stove. Her eyes, sharp as ever, scanned the small stack of papers and notes she had collected over the past days. The unsigned postcard, the cryptic note found at the vicarage, the folded message hidden beneath Hensley's ledger, all pieces of a puzzle she was slowly assembling. She found herself turning again and again to the photograph from the abandoned mill, the younger Harold with the stern, uniformed man. What secret lay behind that image? What debts from the past were dragging their way into the present? The question gnawed quietly at her thoughts. There was a gentle knock at the door. It was Jane Marple's niece, Lucy, a bright and curious young woman with a fondness for puzzles and a keen eye for detail. "Aunt Jane?" Lucy said, stepping in with a hopeful smile. "I thought you might like some company. I've been asking around the village, and some things don't quite add up." Miss Marple welcomed her niece with a warm smile. "I was just pondering the same, Lucy. What have you learned?" Lucy settled into the armchair opposite her aunt, unfolding a small notebook. "First, about that stranger Mrs. Fanshawe mentioned, the man who visited Harold shortly before the party. Several villagers said they saw a tall, sharply dressed man arriving by car, but no one seems to know who he was or where he came from." "Curious," Miss Marple murmured. "And did anyone see him leave?" "No, and that's the oddest part. He arrived, had a brief talk with Harold, and vanished before the garden party began. Some think he might have come back later, but no one saw." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "A visitor with no name, no story, very much like the postcard's sender." Lucy continued. "And then there's the mill. I went back there yesterday and spoke to old Mrs. Pritchard, who used to work there. She remembered Harold's family, especially his father, who was a military man. She said the man in the photo might be his father's commanding officer, Colonel Ashcroft. Apparently there was some scandal involving the colonel and Harold's family years ago, but no one talks about it." "That would explain the uniform," Miss Marple said, tracing the edges of the photograph with her finger. "Old scandals have a way of resurfacing when least expected." Lucy looked up, eyes bright. "Exactly, and there's more. I found out that Colonel Ashcroft had retired nearby, living quietly at Ashfield Manor, just beyond the village." Miss Marple's interest deepened. "A man from the past, quietly nearby? We must pay a visit to Ashfield Manor." They agreed to go that very afternoon, under the guise of a casual call. Miss Marple's intuition told her the colonel's presence was a key to unraveling the mystery. As they approached Ashfield Manor, a stately but weathered house surrounded by ancient oaks, Miss Marple felt the weight of history pressing against the walls. The heavy wooden door opened before they could knock, revealing a tall man with sharp features and eyes that seemed to miss nothing. "Colonel Ashcroft, I presume," Miss Marple said, stepping forward. The colonel inclined his head with a hint of surprise. "And you must be Miss Marple. I've heard of your keen mind. Please come in." Inside, the manor was filled with the scent of aged books and polished wood. Portraits of stern ancestors looked down from the walls, and the air held a quiet dignity tinged with melancholy. Over tea in a small sitting room, Miss Marple gently steered the conversation toward Harold Hensley. "Colonel, I understand you and Mr. Hensley shared a complicated past." The colonel's eyes darkened slightly. "Complicated indeed. Harold's father and I were close once, but a series of events, disagreements over military conduct, some unfortunate accusations, severed our relationship. Harold bore the weight of those past grievances, though he rarely spoke of them." "Did those grievances involve money or loyalty?" Miss Marple inquired softly. "A bit of both, I'm afraid," the colonel replied. "There were debts, old wounds, and a desire to keep the family's name intact. But I assure you, I bore Harold no ill will." Miss Marple sensed layers beneath the colonel's calm words. Pride, regret, perhaps guilt. "And the recent visit to Mr. Hensley, did you speak with him lately?" The colonel hesitated. "I came to warn him. There were rumors spreading that could ruin us both if they surfaced. I hoped to dissuade him from digging into the past." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "Rumors can be dangerous, especially when someone is determined to uncover the truth." After their visit, as Miss Marple and Lucy walked back through the village, the weight of the colonel's words settled heavily between them. The past was alive and dangerous, but so was the present, filled with fears and secrets too perilous to share openly. That evening, at the Gables, Miss Marple found Mrs. Fanshawe alone, her face pale and drawn. "Isabel," she said gently, "I know this is difficult, but we must piece together every thread. Did Harold ever confide in you about who might want to harm him?" Isabel's eyes filled with tears. "There was someone from his law practice, a Mr. Charles Pritchard. They had a falling out over a case years ago. Harold suspected Pritchard of unethical dealings, but he never had proof." Miss Marple's thoughts raced. The names, the grudges, the hidden motives. They began to form a tangled web. The next day, Miss Marple arranged to visit Charles Pritchard's office, a modest building at the edge of town. Pritchard was a man with a sharp tongue and a reputation for being difficult. "Miss Marple," he greeted, feigning surprise. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" "I wish to ask about your relationship with Harold Hensley," she said carefully. "It seems there were tensions." Pritchard's smile was thin. "Tensions, yes. Harold was a thorn in my side, always accusing me of cutting corners, bending the rules. It cost me clients and money." "Did you see him on the day of the garden party?" Miss Marple asked. Pritchard shrugged. "I was in London. Many people can attest to that." Miss Marple nodded, noting his evasiveness. "Did you send any messages to Mr. Hensley? Notes or postcards?" "Not that I recall," Pritchard said quickly. "I'm not in the habit of anonymous threats." As she left, Miss Marple felt the knot of suspicion tighten. Pritchard's bitterness was clear, but did it drive him to murder? Back in her parlor, Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. The pieces were beginning to fall into place. The mysterious visitor, the old military scandal, the acrimonious lawyer, the threatening notes. But something remained just out of reach. Her mind drifted back to Alec Roper, the nervous delivery boy who had first brought the unsigned postcard. There was something in the boy's manner that suggested he knew more than he admitted. The following morning, Miss Marple found Alec at the post office, his eyes wary as she approached. "Would you mind if I asked you a few more questions, Alec?" she said kindly. He nodded, swallowing nervously. I want to help, Miss Marple. I really do. Good. Tell me, did you notice anyone watching you when you delivered the postcard to Mrs. Fanshawe? Alec hesitated, then nodded. Yes. I thought it was just my imagination, but near the garden gate, a man was lurking. I didn't recognize him, but he looked uneasy. Could you describe him? Tall, dark coat, hat pulled low. He vanished before I could get a good look. Miss Marple's brow furrowed. Thank you, Alec. That's very helpful. As the day drew to a close, Miss Marple stood by her window, watching the village settle under a sky brushed with twilight hues. The threads of the mystery were woven tighter than ever, each revealing shadows of the past and motives lurking in plain sight. Her next steps would be delicate, but Miss Marple was certain the truth was near, waiting to be coaxed from the silence of Chipping Dean. The village of Chipping Dean stirred slowly with the dawn, the soft light filtering through the lace curtains of Miss Marple's sitting room. The events of recent days had cast a shadow over the usually serene village, but Miss Marple herself was undeterred. In fact, the subtle workings of human nature and the intricate web of relationships only sharpened her resolve. Each new discovery seemed to pull another thread from the tangle, revealing layers of hidden resentment and unspoken fears. That morning, she resolved to pay a visit to Alec Roper, the post office boy whose nervousness had piqued her curiosity. Perhaps in the boy's hesitant manner and guarded responses lay more than just fear. It might well conceal knowledge he had not yet dared to share. She found Alec at the modest cottage he shared with his mother, a tidy place near the village edge. The boy opened the door, a flicker of surprise crossing his youthful features before he stepped aside to admit her. His mother, a kind-faced woman, nodded a quiet greeting. Miss Marple wasted no time with formalities. "Alec, dear, I've been thinking about what you told me yesterday, about the man lurking near the garden gate when you delivered the postcard. Would you mind telling me more? Anything at all that you noticed, even something small?" Alec's gaze darted around the room as if checking for unseen listeners. I don't really know why he was there. I think he might have been watching me, or maybe Mrs. Fanshawe's house. I didn't see his face properly. His hat was pulled down low and he kept looking over his shoulder like he was worried. Did you recognize his voice, or did he say anything to you? No, nothing. I was too nervous to say anything, and he didn't speak. Miss Marple nodded, encouraging gently. Sometimes it's the quiet ones who hold the most. Did you notice if he left in a hurry or calmly? He left quick, like he didn't want to be seen. The girl's mother interjected softly. Alec's always been a careful lad, but these last days have been hard on him. He's scared of making trouble. Miss Marple smiled warmly. You're doing quite the opposite by helping now, and it's very brave of you. As she left, Miss Marple's mind spun with possibilities. The lurking stranger could be tied to the threats sent to Harold Hensley, or perhaps even the unsolved mystery behind the postcard without a stamp. Whoever he was clearly intent on secrecy. Her thoughts returned to Charles Pritchard, the lawyer with a bitter grudge against Harold. Something about his evasiveness had unsettled Miss Marple. A man who resented a colleague enough to make threats might well be dangerous, but was Pritchard the type to resort to murder? Determined to learn more, Miss Marple arranged to visit the solicitor's offices once again. This time she was accompanied by Inspector Ryland, whose official investigation was progressing slowly but with the usual lack of progress in matters so entwined with personal histories. The office was quiet, save for the steady ticking of an ancient clock and the rustle of papers. Pritchard greeted them with his usual sharp smile, but betrayed none of the irritation Miss Marple expected. "I understand you wish to discuss Harold Hensley further," he said, folding his hands. "I've nothing new to add, I'm afraid. Business disputes and old quarrels, nothing more." Miss Marple studied him carefully. "And what of the debts Mr. Hensley owed? I hear they were more than financial, perhaps personal." Pritchard's smile flickered, and for a moment his eyes hardened. "Rumors, Miss Marple, and dangerous ones. Ryland stepped forward. "Mr. Pritchard, we're here to establish facts, not feed gossip. Can you tell us about your whereabouts the day of the garden party?" "As I said, I was in London," Pritchard replied smoothly. "Several people can confirm. And yet you avoided answering whether you sent any messages to Mr. Hensley." "Messages? I do not engage in childish threats," Pritchard said with thinly veiled disdain. Miss Marple's gaze remained steady. "Childish, perhaps, but effective for intimidation. Are you certain you have no connection to the postcards or notes that have surfaced?" He smiled, but it was brittle now. "I assure you, Miss Marple, I'm a man of law, not blackmail." As they left, Miss Marple felt the familiar sense of a carefully guarded secret. Pritchard was more than a disgruntled lawyer. He was a man with something to hide, though she could not yet say what. Back in the village, the atmosphere was thickening. Rumors swirled like autumn leaves, whispered in corners and over fences. The vicar's cryptic note and the threatening postcard had rattled the community, and with every passing day, suspicion seemed to grow like wildfire. Miss Marple made a quiet visit to Reverend Kelso, whose serene demeanor belied the turmoil inside. The vicar welcomed her into the small study, the late afternoon light casting long shadows over shelves filled with well-worn books. "Miss Marple," he said, clasping his hands, "the notes have disturbed the peace far more than I had hoped. I do not know who seeks to unearth these old wounds, but I fear it will not stop with warnings." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Reverend, do you know of anyone in the village with a grudge against Mr. Hensley or his family?" The vicar sighed. Harold was respected but not universally liked. His forthright manner alienated some, and old resentments linger, but no one I know would resort to violence. "Sometimes, Reverend," she said gently, "it is those closest who bear the heaviest grudges, and sometimes it is those who appear least threatening." The vicar looked troubled. "I pray you are wrong, Miss Marple." That evening, Miss Marple found herself once more at the Gables. The scene of the garden party turned grim tableau. Mrs. Fanshawe welcomed her with a weary smile, but eyes shadowed with worry. "Jane," she said softly, "there is something you must know. Harold, he was working on something before he died. Something he believed would change everything." Miss Marple leaned forward. "What sort of something?" Isabel hesitated. "A file, papers hidden in the library. He called it his last truth. He said it involved the colonel, the lawyer, and others, things some would kill to keep secret." Miss Marple's heart quickened. The story was weaving tighter, the motives deepening. Together, they searched the library, finally uncovering a small locked box behind a false panel in the bookcase. Inside were documents, letters, contracts, and notes, speaking of debts, betrayals, and a tangled web of alliances and betrayals reaching back years. One letter stood out, written in a shaky hand. "To those it may concern, the past cannot be buried forever. Justice demands reckoning." Miss Marple examined the handwriting carefully, recognizing it as Harold's. The note was a warning, but to whom? As night fell over Chipping Dean, the village seemed to hold its breath. The threads of a story long hidden were unraveling, and with each revelation, the true danger lurking in the quiet streets became clearer. Miss Marple sat by her window, the box of secrets before her, contemplating the delicate dance of human nature, how pride, fear, and desperation could twist even the most ordinary lives into something dark and deadly. She knew the truth was near. It would reveal itself not through force or confrontation, but through patience, observation, and the subtle art of reading people's hearts. And she was ready to listen. Miss Marple sat in the quiet comfort of her parlor, the small box of Harold Hensley's papers resting on the table before her like a treasure chest of whispered secrets. The late afternoon light cast long shadows across the floorboards, and the gentle ticking of the old grandfather clock seemed to mark the slow unraveling of a tightly woven mystery. Each piece of paper, each letter, was a fragile thread connecting the past to the present. Threads that Miss Marple knew had to be followed carefully, lest the whole tapestry unravel too soon. As she leafed through the documents once more, her keen eyes caught a small, folded note tucked inside an envelope addressed only with Harold's initials. It was easy to miss amid the heavier legal papers and faded correspondence. Opening it, she read a few hurried lines. "If anything happens to me, look beyond the obvious. The answers lie where no one dares to search, the unspoken debts, the silent witnesses." The note sent a chill through her. Harold had sensed the danger closing in, yet he had chosen to leave this cryptic message rather than reveal his suspicions outright. The phrase "unspoken debts" echoed in Miss Marple's mind, bringing back the Colonel's warning and the lawyer's bitterness. But what of the silent witnesses? Who or what was Harold alluding to? Later that evening, Miss Marple invited Lucy to join her. Together, they spread the papers out across the table, discussing every detail with quiet intensity. "You see, Lucy," Miss Marple began, "Harold's message suggests there are elements of this mystery we have overlooked. People or things unnoticed because they do not speak, or because others refuse to listen." Lucy's brow furrowed. "Like Alec Roper, perhaps. The boy seems afraid to say everything he knows." "Exactly. And others, too, who live on the fringes of the village's consciousness," Miss Marple replied. The next morning, Miss Marple decided it was time to revisit the scene of the crime. She wanted to understand the place as Harold had seen it, to observe what others might have missed. The garden at the Gables was peaceful under the pale sun, but she noticed a subtle disarray, the faint imprint of a footprint in the damp soil near the hedge, the slight disturbance of a flower bed where no footfall should have been. Her gaze lingered on the gate where Alec had seen the mysterious man lurking. There was something unusual about the lock, slightly worn, as if it had been tampered with recently. This small detail, overlooked by the police, struck her as significant. Could someone have entered or exited unnoticed that day? As she contemplated, a sudden voice interrupted her reverie. "Miss Marple?" She turned to see Inspector Ryland approaching, his face serious but respectful. "I thought I might find you here. We've made some progress." "Do tell," she said, inviting him to join her among the blooming roses. Ryland revealed that further inquiries had uncovered a man matching the description Alec gave, a stranger who had been seen speaking to Charles Pritchard in the days before the murder. The man's identity was unknown, but his presence hinted at a conspiracy rather than a lone act of vengeance. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed with quiet satisfaction. "So the lawyer's disdain may have allies." Ryland nodded. "Indeed. We have also learned that the Colonel, despite his denials, had a meeting with Pritchard just days before Harold's death." The pieces were beginning to click. A tangled web of old grievances and new alliances was tightening around the Gables. Miss Marple decided to pay another visit to Ashfield Manor, this time with Lucy accompanying her. The Colonel received them in his study, his composure as unyielding as the dark wood that surrounded him. "I understand you've heard of my recent meeting with Mr. Pritchard," the Colonel said quietly. "We have," Miss Marple responded gently. "Might I ask what it concerned?" The Colonel sighed, the weight of years evident in his eyes. "Old wounds, Miss Marple. There are debts to be settled, not just financial, but of honor and pride. Harold was uncovering things better left buried, and both Pritchard and I wished to prevent scandal." "Did you fear for your reputation?" "Certainly, but I never wished harm to come to Harold." Miss Marple studied him carefully, sensing the truth beneath his words. "And yet harm did come." The Colonel's gaze dropped. "Yes, I fear someone else took matters into their own hands." As they left the manor, Lucy whispered, "Do you think the Colonel is hiding something?" "Perhaps," Miss Marple murmured, "but it may not be what we expect." Back in the village, the tension was palpable. Gossip had taken a new turn with rumors of secret meetings and veiled threats. Miss Marple understood the importance of timing. Press too hard, and the truth might retreat. Wait too long, and evidence could vanish. She decided to visit the vicar again, hoping to glean insight from the man who saw the village's pulse most clearly. Reverend Kelso greeted her warmly, though his eyes were shadowed. "The village is uneasy, Miss Marple. Old secrets are stirring, and fear is growing. Do you know of anyone who has been particularly affected by these recent events?" The vicar hesitated before speaking. "There is one. Margaret Wynne, a reclusive widow who lost her husband under mysterious circumstances years ago. She has kept to herself, but often watches the village with a keen eye." Miss Marple's interest was piqued. "Would you mind introducing me to her?" The following afternoon, Miss Marple and Lucy found themselves at Margaret Wynne's cottage, a quaint but weathered house surrounded by untended gardens. The widow greeted them cautiously but invited them in. Over tea, Margaret spoke softly, her voice carrying the weight of long-held sorrow. "I knew Harold well. He was a good man, honest and brave. I fear his death will open wounds we thought healed." "Did you notice anything unusual in the days before his death?" Miss Marple asked gently. Margaret nodded. "Yes. A man came asking questions about Harold, about his family, his business. I did not recognize him, but there was something unsettling in his tone." "Did he say his name?" "No, but he left a card. Blank, save for a single word. Justice." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Justice. A fitting but dangerous word. As they left, the pieces of the puzzle clicked into place. The threatening messages, the mysterious visitor, the tangled pasts of the Colonel, the lawyer, and now the widow's shadowed testimony. That evening, Miss Marple sat alone, the village cloaked in darkness outside her window. She considered the web of human emotions, pride, fear, bitterness, and love, that had led to Harold's demise. The danger was, not in one person alone, but in the secrets they shared and the lies they told to protect themselves. Her thoughts returned to Alec Roper, the nervous boy who had first delivered the ominous postcard. Perhaps the silent witnesses were not only people but also those quiet details easily overlooked. A footprint, a lock worn smooth, a hesitant glance. Miss Marple knew the next step was to watch, to listen, and to wait for the moment when the truth would slip from the shadows into the light. For in Chipping Dean, where every smile hid a story, the final revelation was yet to come. The morning air in Chipping Dean was crisp, carrying the faint scent of dew and earth. Miss Marple, having spent a restless night turning over every clue and conversation, rose early with a sense of quiet determination. She understood that the village was simmering beneath its calm surface, and that it was time to bring her subtle scrutiny to bear on those who moved among its shadows. She decided her first visit that day would be to Alec Roper, the post office boy whose observations had proven more valuable than anyone had suspected. The boy was not just a messenger of words, but a watcher of things unspoken, and Miss Marple believed he might hold the key to a critical moment in the unfolding drama. As she approached Alec's small cottage once again, she noticed the cautious glance he cast from the window. When she knocked, he opened the door with a mixture of surprise and apprehension. His mother looked on silently from behind him, her expression one of quiet worry. "Good morning, Alec," Miss Marple began softly. "I wondered if you might be willing to help me with something that has been on my mind. I'd like to know if you can recall any small details from the day you delivered that postcard, anything at all." The boy hesitated, then nodded slowly. I'm not sure, Miss Marple. But there was something strange about the man I saw. He wasn't just watching the garden gate. He seemed to be waiting for someone." "Waiting, you say?" Miss Marple prompted gently. "Did you notice if anyone else came by shortly after?" Alec frowned, concentrating. "Yes, there was someone else. A woman. She came quickly, looking over her shoulder like she was scared. I didn't recognize her. She spoke to the man, but I couldn't hear what they said." Miss Marple's eyes brightened. "Did they part ways afterward?" "Yeah, the man left through the back lane and the woman went toward the village square." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "That is very helpful, Alec. You've done well to remember." As she left the cottage, Miss Marple pondered the implication. The woman's sudden appearance and hurried departure suggested a secret meeting, perhaps a warning or a threat. Who was she, and how was she connected to the growing tension in Chipping Dean? Her thoughts led her to Margaret Wynne, the widow whose quiet presence had hinted at deeper knowledge. If anyone knew of a woman who had recently stirred in the village, Margaret might. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple and Lucy made their way back to the widow's cottage. Margaret welcomed them with a mixture of relief and caution, as if their visit had been expected but was nonetheless unsettling. "Miss Marple," she said in a low voice, "there is something you should know. That woman Alex saw, I believe it was Edith Lambton, the new school teacher." Lucy's eyes widened. "Edith Lambton? I thought she was new to the village and kept mostly to herself." "She does," Margaret replied, "but she has been seen speaking in hushed tones with several villagers, always nervous, always in a hurry. I suspect she knows more than she admits." Miss Marple was intrigued. The school teacher's arrival had been barely noticed until now, but her sudden involvement suggested a connection to the unrest. That evening, Miss Marple decided to visit the village pub, the Red Fox, a hub where whispers often spilled and masks slipped. It was here that she might observe Edith Lambton in her element, or at least gather clues from those who knew her. The pub was warm and dimly lit, filled with the murmur of voices and the clink of glasses. Miss Marple found a quiet corner from which to watch. Her sharp eyes soon spotted Edith entering, her demeanor tense, her gaze scanning the room as if searching for someone. Miss Marple noted how the villagers responded to Edith, a mixture of curiosity, suspicion, and a touch of sympathy. It was clear Edith was not fully accepted, perhaps because she was an outsider or because she carried her own secrets. As the night deepened, Miss Marple saw Edith approach a table where Charles Pritchard was seated, deep in conversation with an older man she did not recognize. Their talk was brief but animated, and Edith left with a troubled expression. The next morning, Miss Marple called on Edith at the village school. The young woman greeted her politely but with a guarded air. "Miss Marple," Edith began, "I don't know what you've heard, but I assure you I am not involved in anything untoward." Miss Marple smiled gently. "My dear, I'm merely a curious observer. Sometimes the smallest things reveal the most." Edith hesitated, then confessed, "I did speak with Mr. Pritchard and the other gentlemen. They were concerned about old family debts and whispered threats. They want to keep certain matters quiet for the sake of the village's reputation." "Whispered threats," Miss Marple repeated softly. "Yes, Harold's investigation stirred things up. Things some want to stay buried." Miss Marple's mind raced. The lawyer's bitter grudge, the colonel's secrets, the mysterious visitor, and now Edith's revelations all painted a complex picture of a community struggling under the weight of its own history. That afternoon, Miss Marple and Lucy met with Inspector Ryland, sharing their new findings. Ryland listened carefully, noting Edith's connection to Pritchard and the presence of the unknown man. "There's clearly a conspiracy at work," Ryland admitted. "But who benefits from murder?" Miss Marple's gaze was steady. "Not just who benefits, Inspector, but who is desperate enough to silence the past." Together, they planned to watch Edith's movements, hoping she might unwittingly lead them to the truth. Days passed, and Miss Marple's patience was rewarded when Edith, under the guise of solitude, was observed meeting again with the stranger Alec had described. This time, the meeting was tense, the woman's composure cracking as she clutched a folded letter. Miss Marple sensed that Edith was caught between fear and loyalty, a pawn in a game larger than she wished to admit. As the village held its breath, Miss Marple prepared for the moment when the threads would finally unravel, confident that the subtle clues, the quiet fears, and the hidden debts would reveal the murderer's identity and the true story behind the postcard sent without a stamp. The village of Chipping Dean had settled into an uneasy rhythm as Miss Marple continued her quiet but persistent inquiry into the mystery that had gripped the community. The postcard, so simple yet so peculiar, remained at the heart of her thoughts. It was not merely a message, but a symbol, a key to unlocking a labyrinth of secrets. And now, with the web of characters and their shifting alliances becoming clearer, Miss Marple felt the weight of the truth drawing closer. Early one morning, as the first light gilded the church steeple, Miss Marple found herself walking towards the gables once more. The air was sharp and still, and the village was just beginning to stir awake. She had resolved to revisit the scene with a renewed focus, paying close attention to the small details that might have escaped notice in the bustle of earlier investigations. As she passed through the garden gate, the faint impression in the soil caught her eye again, the footprint she had spotted before. Kneeling, she studied it more carefully, noting its shape and size. It was smaller than she'd first assumed, perhaps belonging to a woman. The direction suggested someone had entered from the back hedge rather than the front gate, a path less visible to neighbors or passers-by. This subtle clue sparked a train of thought. The meetings Edith Lambton had been seen having, the mysterious woman Alec had spotted, and the tension between the villagers. It was becoming clear that whoever moved through the garden was more intimately connected to the events than anyone had realized. As Miss Marple rose, a rustling noise near the rose bushes startled her. She glanced over and saw Lucy approaching, a small notebook in hand, her expression eager. "I've been speaking with some of the villagers," Lucy said quietly. "There's been talk about Edith's past, before she came to Chipping Dean. Some say she left a troubled home in London, possibly fleeing scandal or danger." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Fear and flight often bring people into strange new circumstances. It's possible Edith's silence is born of self-preservation rather than guilt." They walked together towards the village square, where the market stalls were being set up for the day. Miss Marple intended to observe the flow of daily life, to catch the undercurrents beneath the surface cheerfulness. The crowd was lively, with familiar faces greeting one another and newcomers blending in cautiously. Miss Marple noted Charles Pritchard standing by the butcher's stall, his posture rigid, eyes flickering toward a nearby alley. The lawyer's tension was palpable, as though he carried invisible burdens heavier than any document he'd ever signed. As the morning wore on, Miss Marple's attention shifted to a slender figure moving discreetly through the crowd. Edith Lambton. Her movements were cautious, almost furtive, and she frequently glanced over her shoulder as if pursued by unseen eyes. Curiosity piqued, Miss Marple followed at a respectful distance. Edith slipped down the alley toward the old mill, a place that had long been abandoned but still held memories of the village's past. There, Edith paused beside a crumbling stone wall and waited. Soon, the stranger Alec had described appeared, tall, dark-haired, with a presence that seemed both familiar and foreign in this quiet village. They exchanged hurried words, and Edith handed him the folded letter Miss Marple had glimpsed days before. The man's expression hardened as he read, then he slipped the note into his pocket and glanced around nervously. Miss Marple lingered in the shadows, absorbing every detail. The stranger's involvement added complexity to the already tangled mystery. He was clearly not a casual visitor, but a player in the village's hidden drama. The next day, Miss Marple invited Inspector Ryland and Lucy to her home. Laying out the chronology and the growing list of interactions, She spoke with calm conviction. This letter, this meeting, they suggest the murder is not an isolated act, but part of a larger scheme involving threats and secrets predating Harold's investigation. Ryland nodded slowly. The more we learn, the more it seems that old grudges and silent debts have festered far longer than we realized. But who would gain most from silencing Harold? Lucy asked. And why the postcard, sent without a stamp? Miss Marple smiled faintly. The postcard was a signal, a warning cloaked in innocence. Sending it without a stamp ensured it would be noticed, as if the sender wanted it to be found, but misunderstood. The three considered the possibilities. It was clear the murderer was desperate not just to conceal a crime, but to control the narrative. Later, Miss Marple arranged a meeting with Edith at the village hall under the pretense of discussing village affairs. The young woman arrived tense but composed. "Miss Marple," Edith began, "I've been torn between protecting myself and revealing what I know, but the danger is real. Harold was close to uncovering something that could destroy more than a few reputations." "Tell me what you mean," Miss Marple urged gently. Edith hesitated, then confided. "There are old debts owed not just in money, but in silence. The Colonel, Pritchard, and others have skeletons they guard fiercely. Harold threatened to expose them. And this stranger, the man you met at the mill." Edith's eyes darkened. "He is a link to those debts, a messenger and enforcer. He watches, threatens, and ensures the silence is maintained." Miss Marple's mind worked quickly. This stranger was a shadow casting length over the village's peaceful facade. His presence was a constant reminder of the power old secrets held. As they spoke, Edith admitted she had a letter from the stranger, a threat warning her to stay silent or face consequences. Miss Marple asked to see it, and Edith reluctantly handed it over. The letter was terse, its handwriting sharp and deliberate. "Keep quiet, or the past will destroy you all." Miss Marple folded the note carefully, her eyes thoughtful. "This letter confirms the web of fear binding Chipping Dean." After Edith left, Miss Marple shared her thoughts with Lucy and Ryland. "We must be cautious. The murderer is still among us, watching and waiting for the right moment. But every secret has a weakness, every threat a crack through which the truth can shine." Ryland agreed. "We should increase surveillance on those connected to the stranger and Pritchard. The time for subtlety is passing." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Yet sometimes the quietest voice reveals the loudest truth." In the days that followed, the village seemed to hold its breath. The tension was palpable, like the calm before a storm. Miss Marple moved carefully among her neighbors, listening to hushed conversations, watching glances exchanged with veiled hostility or fear. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the hills, a sudden commotion shattered the village's uneasy calm. At the village square, Edith Lambton was found collapsed, pale and trembling, clutching a torn piece of paper in her hand. Rushed inside the local doctor's care, Edith was weak but conscious. She whispered that someone had threatened her again, this time more aggressively, and warned her to stop speaking or suffer worse consequences. Miss Marple visited Edith the next day, bringing calm words and quiet reassurance. "Fear is a cruel companion, but courage can be even stronger," she said softly. Edith nodded, tears glistening. "I want to tell the truth, Miss Marple. I just need to be sure I'll be safe." The detective's eyes gleamed with determination. "We will see justice done, my dear. You are not alone." As Edith recovered, Miss Marple pieced together the fragments of the puzzle with renewed urgency. The postcard, the letters, the secret meetings, and the threats all pointed toward a final confrontation looming on the horizon. A moment when the silence would be broken and the murderer's carefully constructed facade would crumble. In the heart of Chipping Dean, the village held its breath, waiting for the truth to emerge from the shadows. And Miss Marple, ever watchful, prepared to gently but decisively unveil the story behind the postcards sent without a stamp. The days after Edith's collapse passed in a haze of whispered fears and guarded glances. The village of Chipping Dean seemed suspended in a fragile stillness, as though the weight of unspoken secrets pressed down on every stone and leaf. Miss Marple, with her usual quiet resolve, intensified her vigilance. She knew that the moment of revelation was drawing near, and that patience, as always, was her ally. Edith's condition improved slowly under the care of Dr. Hargreaves, who was both concerned and puzzled by the young woman's ordeal. When Miss Marple visited Edith once more, she found the school teacher sitting by the window, a faint flush of color returning to her cheeks. "I am grateful for your kindness, Miss Marple," Edith said softly, "though I fear the danger is far from over. Someone in this village wants to keep their past hidden, no matter the cost." Miss Marple nodded. "Indeed, but the past has a way of revealing itself, especially when stirred by those who seek justice." Their conversation was interrupted by a knock on the door. It was Inspector Ryland, his expression serious. "Miss Marple, I've just received word from the constables. There's been another incident at the old mill." A chill ran through Miss Marple's spine. The mill, once a silent witness to the village's history, was now a stage for its present turmoil. They hurried to the scene where a small crowd had gathered, murmuring anxiously. The constables had found evidence of a struggle, disturbed earth, a torn piece of fabric caught on a bramble, and, most unsettling, a second postcard, this one also without a stamp, discarded near the river bank. Miss Marple bent down to examine the torn fabric. It was delicate, part of a woman's scarf. Her eyes narrowed as she compared it to the scarf Edith had worn the day of her first meeting with the stranger. "It seems the danger has escalated," Miss Marple observed quietly. "Someone is desperate to silence those who come too close." Inspector Ryland sighed heavily. "We must increase protection for Edith and keep a close watch on all those connected to the case." Miss Marple's mind raced as she pieced together the significance of the second postcard. It was no mere coincidence. It was a deliberate message, a signal of the murderer's confidence and audacity. Back at the Gables, Miss Marple convened a small gathering with Lucy and the inspector. "The postcards are more than threats. They are clues. Someone wanted them to be found, but misunderstood, perhaps intentionally, to mislead." Lucy frowned. "But who benefits from such deception?" Miss Marple looked thoughtfully at the two. "The person who seeks to control the story, to protect a reputation built on long-buried sins." As the afternoon waned, Miss Marple's attention turned once again to Charles Pritchard. The lawyer's restless behavior and secretive meetings suggested he was at the heart of the village's tangled affairs. She arranged a discreet visit to Pritchard's home under the guise of a friendly call. He received her with polite reserve, though his eyes flickered with unease. "Mr. Pritchard," Miss Marple began gently, "I wonder if you might help me understand more about the debts and threats that have unsettled the village." Pritchard's jaw tightened. "Miss Marple, some matters are best left alone. They belong to the past, and digging them up only causes pain. But pain can sometimes be a necessary step toward healing," she replied softly. "I only wish to ensure no innocent person suffers unjustly." Pritchard sighed, his defenses lowering. "Very well. There was an agreement long ago, a financial arrangement between my family and the Colonel's. It was meant to be discreet, but over time, resentment grew. Harold, in his investigation, threatened to expose this, which would ruin reputations and livelihoods." Miss Marple nodded. "And the stranger? The man seen with Edith?" Pritchard's gaze darkened. "An enforcer, perhaps, sent to ensure silence. But I do not condone violence. This is a matter of pride and fear, not blood." Leaving Pritchard's home, Miss Marple felt the threads tightening. The village was a stage on which old resentments played out with dangerous consequences. That evening, she confided in Lucy. There is one more person we must consider, the Colonel himself. His temper and history with the village are well known. He holds secrets that, if revealed, could change everything. Lucy nodded. But confronting him will not be easy. No, Miss Marple agreed, but the truth demands courage. The following morning, Miss Marple called on Colonel Stokes at his estate. The Colonel greeted her with a wary nod, his posture stiff but not unkind. Miss Marple, to what do I owe this visit? He asked. I'm hoping to understand more about the past you share with Mr. Pritchard, she said. There are questions that require answers. The Colonel's eyes flashed. Some things are better left buried, but if Harold's investigation threatened that peace, then I cannot say I regret his silence. Silence that cost a life, Miss Marple said gently. The Colonel's expression hardened. I did not kill Harold, but I admit I wish the matter would disappear. Miss Marple studied him carefully. Wishing and doing are different, Colonel, yet the consequences are often the same. Their conversation ended with little resolution, but it added weight to the suspicion that the true killer had been acting to protect a fragile legacy. That afternoon, Miss Marple returned home to find a letter slipped beneath her door. It was unsigned, written in a hurried hand. Stop asking questions, or the next message will be your last. The message chilled her, but it also steeled her resolve. The murderer was close, watching, willing to strike again. But Miss Marple was no stranger to danger. Her strength lay in patience, observation, and understanding. She shared the letter with Inspector Ryland, who promised heightened vigilance. Lucy stayed by her side, steadfast and supportive. Days later, a village meeting was called, ostensibly to restore calm, but in truth to bring the community together and, Miss Marple hoped, to unsettle the murderer. As villagers gathered in the hall, the air thick with tension, Miss Marple stood quietly at the back, watching faces that masked fear, guilt, or innocence. She noticed subtle glances exchanged between Pritchard and the stranger, who had now been identified as a Mr. Garston, a man with a shadowy past and unknown motives. Then, with deliberate calm, Miss Marple began to speak, not of accusations, but of stories, of human nature, and of the invisible threads that bind people together and sometimes tear them apart. Her words were gentle but piercing, casting light on the hidden resentments, the small betrayals, and the desperate attempts to protect reputations at all costs. As she spoke, the atmosphere shifted. Eyes lowered, whispers ceased, and the collective breath of the village caught in anticipation. Miss Marple ended with a quiet smile. The truth, like a seed, will grow even in the darkest soil. It is only a matter of time before it blooms. In that charged silence, a single sharp noise shattered the stillness, the sound of a chair scraping back sharply, footsteps moving quickly toward the door. Miss Marple turned slowly, her eyes meeting those of the man who had just risen. Charles Pritchard. His face was pale, his composure unraveling. "Enough," he said, voice trembling. "I cannot bear this any longer." The room held its breath, sensing that the long-hidden story was finally reaching its climax. Miss Marple's gaze was steady, patient. The final test was at hand. Charles Pritchard's sudden outburst sent a ripple through the gathered crowd, the collective tension snapping like a taut wire. His pale face betrayed the storm inside. A battle between fear, guilt, and something more urgent, perhaps a desperate need for confession. For a moment, the entire village hall seemed suspended in stillness, each person held captive by the charged atmosphere. Miss Marple, steady as ever, watched him intently. There was no rush, no dramatic flourish in her manner, only the quiet patience that had unraveled so many tangled truths before. "Mr. Pritchard," she said, gently, "perhaps it is time to speak freely. Whatever burden you carry will be lighter shared." The lawyer's gaze flickered around the room, noting the eyes fixed on him, some wide with shock, others narrowed with suspicion. His breath came uneven, and with a trembling hand, he reached into his pocket and produced a folded piece of paper. Unfolding it slowly, he cleared his throat and began, voice low but growing stronger with each word. There is much about Harold's death and the shadows over this village that I have withheld. Not out of malice, but from fear of ruin, of disgrace, and of the unknown consequences of truth. His eyes met Miss Marple's, seeking some small measure of understanding. He spoke of old agreements between families, debts not just financial, but personal, whispers of betrayal and regret dating back decades. Harold stumbled upon a secret involving the Colonel and myself, an arrangement made years ago to cover up a tragedy involving a young woman whose name was never spoken again. We thought it was buried, but Harold's curiosity was relentless. He paused, the paper shaking slightly in his hand. The stranger you saw, the man named Garston, he was sent to intimidate those who might reveal the truth. He acted as a shadow, a threat, though I did not know of his capacity for violence until too late. A murmur ran through the crowd, the weight of his confession settling like dust in the stale air. Miss Marple nodded encouragingly. "And the murder, Mr. Pritchard? How did it come to pass?" Pritchard swallowed hard. "It was not meant to be murder. Harold confronted me at the Gables, demanding answers. The argument escalated. Garston was there. He struck Harold in panic when the situation spun out of control. It was a tragic accident, and then panic turned to silence. The room was heavy with disbelief and horror. Ryland stepped forward, a mix of resolve and sympathy in his eyes. "Charles Pritchard, you will come with us now. We will need to examine the evidence and ensure justice is served." As constables moved to gently detain Pritchard, he gave one last glance toward Miss Marple, a flicker of relief amidst the fear. "Thank you for your understanding." Outside the village hall, the sun was setting, casting a golden glow that seemed to promise a new beginning. Miss Marple, Lucy, and Ryland stood quietly, the weight of the day settling upon them. "You were right, Miss Marple," Ryland said quietly. "The truth was tangled, but your patience uncovered it." Miss Marple smiled softly. "The truth often lies beneath layers of fear and silence. It takes time and kindness to draw it out." Lucy reached for her hand. "And courage. Edith will be safer now, and the village can start to heal." As night fell over Chipping Dean, a gentle breeze stirred the leaves, whispering of secrets laid to rest and the fragile peace that comes when shadows retreat. Miss Marple knew that while wounds take time to heal, the first step was always the hardest, the step into light. The village of Chipping Dean seemed to hold its breath in the days following Charles Pritchard's confession. The heavy fog of suspicion and fear slowly began to lift, replaced by an uneasy calm that settled over the once troubled streets and cottages. Miss Marple, ever watchful, knew the story was not yet complete. There was one final truth to uncover, one subtle piece of the puzzle that had remained elusive until now. In the quiet of her drawing room at the Gables, she sat with Lucy and Inspector Ryland, the air filled with the scent of freshly brewed tea. The gentle ticking of the clock marked the slow passing of time, a reminder that the final moments of mystery often come not with clamor, but with quiet reflection. "It was the postcards that first drew my attention," Miss Marple began softly. "They were sent without stamps, which on the surface seemed trivial, but in truth it was a deliberate signal. The sender wished the messages to be noticed yet misread, to create confusion and misdirection." Lucy frowned, remembering the fragile paper found by the river bank. "But who would send such a message, and why?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "That is precisely the question. While Charles Pritchard bore the burden of the fatal blow in a moment of panic, the mastermind behind the escalating threats and the strange clues was not he." Ryland leaned forward, intrigued. "You mean there was another?" "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "Someone who stood to lose the most from Harold's probing inquiries. Someone who wielded influence with quiet menace and a keen understanding of human nature." She paused, letting the moment settle. "Consider the figure who remained always just out of sight, who maintained a facade of concern and civility while carefully manipulating events. Mrs. Agnes Hargrave, the village's seemingly devoted church warden." Lucy blinked in surprise. Agnes, but she was so kind. "Kindness is often a well-crafted mask," Miss Marple said gently. Mrs. Hargrave harbored a long-standing grudge against Harold's family, tied to a scandal involving her own late husband, a disgrace he blamed on the Colonel's past. Agnes saw Harold's investigation as a threat to the fragile social order she had fought to uphold. The pieces clicked together: Agnes's quiet visits to the mill, her subtle interference with village gossip, the unnoticed but sharp exchanges with Garston. She was the one who sent the postcards, the ones without stamps, Miss Marple continued, a warning to those who dared to dig too deep, delivered with the knowledge that the missing stamps would puzzle and delay the authorities. Ryland's expression darkened. "And Garston, was he her hired muscle?" "Indeed," Miss Marple confirmed, "a man willing to intimidate and ultimately to strike when fear turned to violence. But when Charles's panic spiraled into tragedy, Agnes's plan began to unravel." The inspector stood, resolve firm. "Then Mrs. Hargrave must be confronted." Miss Marple nodded. "With care and tact, she's not a woman to be underestimated." At the village church, under the stained glass windows filtering soft afternoon light, Miss Marple, Ryland, and Lucy met with Mrs. Hargrave. The churchwarden's face was pale, her composure faltering under their calm scrutiny. "Mrs. Hargrave," Miss Marple began, "the time has come to speak honestly. The village deserves peace, and only truth can grant it." For a moment, silence reigned. Then the woman's shoulders sagged and her voice trembled. "I did what I thought necessary. I feared the destruction Harold's revelations would bring, not just to families, but to our way of life. I sent the postcards. I employed Garston to guard those secrets." "But you did not kill Harold?" Ryland asked. "No," she whispered. "That was a terrible accident. I only wanted to frighten, to protect." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Fear, when left unchecked, often leads to tragedy. It is a lesson we all must learn." As the village slowly recovered, forgiveness and understanding began to weave their fragile threads through the community. Edith, too, found comfort in the knowledge that the danger had passed, and in the kindness of friends who stood by her. Miss Marple returned to her garden, tending her flowers with the same quiet care she applied to human nature. She reflected on the curious ways people hide behind masks, how the smallest gesture, an unstamped postcard, a torn scarf, can speak volumes if one knows how to listen. In the peaceful evening light, she murmured to herself, "The heart of human nature is a garden of secrets, some poisonous, some sweet. It is our task to tend it with patience and understanding, for in those secrets lies the truth we seek." And with that, the village of Chipping Dean slipped back into its gentle rhythms, forever marked by the subtle wisdom of one remarkable woman who understood that in every face a story waits to be told.